So welcome back guys to another video, and today I'm doing yet another tier list, and I'm doing a Castlevania tier list, one of my favorite series of all time. Now, just as a disclaimer, just like my Final Fantasy tier list, these are all my opinions. This is all my taste in gaming, may differ from everyone else, and also I'm only going to be covering the Western releases for handheld and consoles. I'm not going to be covering any pachinko games. I've done that in the past, as well as some of the mobile releases. And the only reason why I'm not including some of the Japanese releases is because I haven't played a whole lot of, like, say, Castlevania on the MSX. So I really wanted to stick to the games that I know and loved over the years. Alright, so the first game is, of course, the very first Castlevania, released in 1987 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, one of my all-time favorites, a game that I still play to this day, and I'm giving it a B tier. And the only reason why I'm giving it a B tier is because I feel like a lot of the other releases after Castlevania are just better games. But with that being said, Castlevania is still such a classic. It's still just such an amazing game. And next up is Simon's Quest. You know what? The thing about Simon's Quest is I feel like a lot of people over the years have absolutely hated Simon's Quest. And I understand. It's a very cryptic game. It's a huge departure from the first release. But it paved the way for a lot of Castlevania games in the future that we would grow and love. So with that being said, I would have to give Castlevania Simon's Quest, putting it right here on C. It's not as good as the first Castlevania, but it's not a bad game. It's, like I said, it's cryptic, but if you look up a guide, and there's also a lot of fan games where they've like retranslated it, and it's just a better game. And plus, it introduced us to Bloody Tears, one of the most iconic Castlevania themes. Now, stepping away from the original Nintendo and going into the handheld realm with the OG Game Boy, next up is going to be Castlevania Adventure. And listen, we all knew back in the day that there were some compromises when it came to playing games on handheld compared to console. It wasn't like how it is today with the Nintendo Switch and Steam Deck, obviously. But with that being said, I have to give Castlevania Adventure, I have to put it right here in the D tier. It's not a good game. I mean, even knowing that the Game Boy games weren't as good as home console, you still had competent releases like Super Mario Land and Metroid 2. You also had Link's Awakening. So, with that being said, Castlevania Adventure is just not a good game. The level design is not that great. Soundtrack's amazing. And Christopher Belmont just walks very slow. And I hated the fact that whenever he got hit, his whip would actually get weaker. I wasn't a big fan of that. Not a big fan of Castlevania Adventure. But of course, going back to the NES, one of my favorite Castlevanias of all time, and this is the first A tier, and that is going to be Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Took everything I loved about the first Castlevania and upped it, with extra characters like Grant, Alucard, and Cypher. Non-linear paths, so it adds some replayability. That badass scene with Trevor Belmont at the altar throwing off his cloak, and the music alone. Castlevania 3 is a classic and definitely A tier. Speaking of A tier, this is not only a classic Castlevania, but a classic SNES all around. You guys know it. Super Castlevania 4. This game is so freaking good. I mean, we're cooking with gas. Simon can move his wrists in all 8 directions in this game. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but that was a game changer back then. And the Mode 7 graphics, 1991 was a great year for gamers because you had so many great titles, including Super Castlevania 4, that was honestly super. It was so amazing. Now, I wasn't a big fan of Castlevania Adventure, but I am a fan of Belmont's Revenge, and I'm putting that right here beside Simon's Quest. It's still not a Castlevania that I go back to often, but I really like it a lot more than Adventure. I thought it was kind of interesting. It had a stage select very, similar to like Mega Man, and there was one stage where you're just straight up in the clouds. I thought that was wild. But I mean, I feel like they kind of took the constructive criticism of Castlevania Adventure and tried to make it better. And with the limitations of the Game Boy, it really worked, and it's actually a pretty decent Castlevania game to play on the go. Probably the best out of the 3 OG Castlevania games on the Game Boy. Next up is a underrated Castlevania game in my opinion. Well, I don't really say my opinion because a lot of people say it's underrated, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in A tier, and that is Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis. I didn't play this game until much later after its release because I didn't get a Genesis until a lot later. But I do remember that the Genesis growing up always felt like, you know, the grown-up kids' console. Like if you had an older sibling, they were playing Genesis while you were still playing NES. And when you're playing Bloodlines, you feel that because you see some of the graphics, some of the blood, some of the gore in this game. I mean, even some little details like flies, you know, swarming around the zombies. It was freaking cool, and I really love playing as Eric Lacarde. His spear attack is just something else, and the soundtrack. Oh my God, the soundtrack of Castlevania with the Sega Genesis sound chip is just god tier. Castlevania Dracula X on the Super Nintendo is going to be getting another D tier. I know this is the game that's popular to hate, especially with, you know, how accessible Rondo of Blood is now, and because this is essentially a kind of demake in some regards of Rondo of Blood. I mean, it was a lot of stuff other than like the stage designs being completely different. I mean, you couldn't play as Maria in Dracula X, and I thought the level design, even back then, I didn't like the level design. There was a lot of like really annoying platforming, and at the time when I played Dracula X, you gotta understand, I didn't play Rondo of Blood. I didn't have a TurboGrafx 16 as a kid. I honestly didn't even know about Rondo of Blood until years later. But, you know, going from playing, say, Super Castlevania 4 and going to Dracula X, it felt like such a setback. I'm like, man, why can't Richter Belmont use his wrist like Simon? And I mean, was that not passed down in the Belmont training handbook? I mean, come on now. It's just not as good of a game as, like, say, Super Castlevania 4, in my opinion. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. That, I feel like this whole video would be a cardinal sin if I didn't put it in A tier, because not only is this a great PlayStation 1 game because it utilized 2D sprites to the whole nine. I mean, this is such a beautiful game that still looks as good as the day it came out, but also this introduced us to the Metroidvania kind of gameplay, which would revolutionize and inspire a whole genre. Most of your collection on the Switch that are Metroidvanias would not exist without Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And, you know, at the time when Konami made Symphony of the Night and, you know, the gaming market was really into 3D polygons, I thought it was very ballsy, even back then, for them to make a 2D game, and it is so amazing. Now, Konami was trying to keep cooking up some hits and keep people interested after Symphony of the Night because it was so wildly successful that they actually re-released the Castlevania games that was exclusive for Japanese PCs, and that was the release of Castlevania Chronicles on the PlayStation. And you know what? This is going to get a C. And the reason is because when it comes to Simon Belmont, I just want to play Super Castlevania 4. I don't like Chronicles as much. I think it's definitely a lot more difficult, but I don't really like the soundtrack and went for this weird, like, techno house mix. I didn't really care for that. You know, it was one of those games that when I was wanting to complete a physical Castlevania collection, it was one of those games I had to get, and by the time I had to get it, I had to pay a lot more than it was worth. So maybe I'm a little biased because I spent a lot of money at the time. Like, I think I spent like $50 or $60, which was unheard of back then for a PlayStation 1 game, and it just wasn't as good. It really wasn't. See, I want to like Castlevania Legends. I want to like it because I like Sonia Belmont. I like her character design. I love the soundtrack, but it's going in the D tier because this was such a step back from Belmont's Revenge. There was a couple of years span between Belmont's Revenge and Legends was actually a later release for the Game Boy. So you thought, you know, with it being a later release, they would really push the boundaries of the hardware, and it would be a really good game, especially riding off the high of Symphony of the Night. But it felt half-baked. It was a very half-baked Castlevania release, and for that, it's getting a D tier. All right, now Castlevania is going to the 3D realm with the N64, and I'm going to go ahead and do both these games in one hit. Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness are both getting B tier. I don't know, this is going to break the internet. Folks are like, What? B tier? It's going to be above, you know, all these other games? Because most people really love to hate Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness. I think they were kind of ambitious releases. They were kind of broken. They weren't the best entry to the Castlevania 3D, but that's where it all started. And there were some aspects that I felt like I was almost playing a Resident Evil game with some of the puzzles. And I did like the fact that in Castlevania 64, you could turn into a vampire. Like, you could actually get infected and not be able to use your holy weapons. I thought that was a very interesting take. And, you know, it's one of those games, like both of them, because they were released like 11 months apart. It's one of those things that I feel like they're fun to experience. They're really, really fun. They're not the best, but they're not that bad. We're going back to the handheld realm, this time the Game Boy Advance with Castlevania Circle of the Moon, and that is getting a delicious B tier right here. I love Circle of the Moon. I love the card system. It's a very grindy game, I do admit, but I like the fact they reused some of the Bloodlines music. Some of the sprite work was kind of reused from Symphony of the Night as well. The story, you know, following Nathan Graves, I thought that was kind of cool. You see Dracula in the beginning of the game, which was unheard of. Starting Castlevania and seeing Dracula right there was interesting, but I think Castlevania Circle of the Moon was a lot of fun and very comparable to Symphony of the Night on the go at that time. But things got even better with Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance, which is another B tier. I have to admit, I'm a bigger fan of Circle of the Moon than I am Harmony of Dissonance, mainly because of the soundtrack. I feel like Harmony of Dissonance has a very farty soundtrack. I feel like it sounds like passing gas. But the game itself is wonderful. The bosses are a lot more simpler. Very simple patterns, very quick, snappy boss fights. But overall, a much better experience than, say, you know, Castlevania Legends or Castlevania Adventure. Bar none. But Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, the last Game Boy Advance release, is definitely A tier. One of my absolute favorite Castlevanias. Is another Metroidvania through and through, but I love the story. I love, you know, Soma Cruz becoming the reincarnation of Dracula and having to decide, you know, if he's going to be a bad guy or he's going to be a good guy. I think Julius, Belmont, and Alucard the whole time are kind of on the edge of their seats, being like, are we going to have to kill this guy? Are we going to have to pull another Battle of 1999, which is a shame we never got a game made from that. But yeah, Aria of Sorrow is like a definite must-have for anyone that's playing the Game Boy Advance. This is a game you have to have in your collection. Now, Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness was the first steps that Konami made to make a 3D Castlevania, and it was kind of lukewarm. It wasn't terrible, but Lament of Innocence was even better. And I remember when this game came out, Konami was really pushing the fact that this was made by the same people that did Symphony of the Night. I remember seeing it on the box. But, you know, by today's standards, if you were to play Lament of Innocence, it has aged a little bit. But it's still a great game and a beginning to the Igarashi timeline, the very beginning of Castlevania in that sort of universe. I still don't think it's the best 3D Castlevania, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And it's an A tier, it's a definite must play. Now see, as much as I loved Aria of Sorrow, Dawn of Sorrow, the sequel on the Nintendo DS, I didn't like as much, to be honest. I'm putting it right here with C tier. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking I didn't like drawing the runes, and I didn't. The boss fights with the touchscreen at that final blow was so gimmicky. It was cool at first, but then after a while, it got worse. But I recently started playing a fan hack that completely takes away the touchscreen feature, so you don't have to worry about it. But even with that being said, I feel like Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow was kind of phoned in. You know, I didn't feel the same oomph as I did with Aria of Sorrow. I didn't feel like it was as good of a game, but graphically it's beautiful. It's a very beautiful game, but it's just not as good. But my favorite 3D Castlevania would have to be Castlevania Curse of Darkness. I'm actually putting it right here in front of Lament of Innocence because I feel like it is a better game, but wow, this is the game that you could play right now, and it feels like it's aged so well. It's got a really good camera system, snappy combat. I love the Innocent Devils because, you know, Hector was a Devil Forge master, so he can actually, you know, breed his own familiars, and that adds so much replayability and so many action RPG elements that I really do enjoy. And if you enjoy Pokemon, you'll like the Innocent Devils, because it kind of made me think of Pokemon or Tamagotchi, but with Castlevania. And I really love it. I'm a huge fan of Castlevania 3, and with this being a sequel, that also kind of plays into it, because I loved, Hector and Trevor Belmont's banter. It was really, really cool. It's a shame that it hasn't been re-released as that HD remaster. I think it would sell really, really well. I have so many memories of this game right here, and it's one of my favorite games of all time, and that is Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. I'm a huge, like I said earlier with Curse of Darkness, I'm a huge Castlevania 3 fan, so I really enjoyed Portrait of Ruin, being able to switch between characters. Yes, it was really annoying to keep hearing Jonathan, Charlotte, Jonathan, Charlotte. You got to get used to that, because you're going to be hearing it a lot. But it's a sequel to Bloodlines, which is another Castlevania that I love. It dives more into the Belmont lore of like why for like 100 years the Belmonts weren't, the center of the Castlevania world. So I thought that was great. It was just an amazing game. It's a shame that a lot of these games haven't been re-released as some sort of HD remaster or a DS collection, because I feel like more people need to play Portrait of Ruin, because it was an amazing game, and it was helping celebrate at the time 25 years of Castlevania. So there were a lot of Easter eggs for longtime fans as well. Now you may be thinking, Xander, you're just liking all the Castlevania games. Not this one. Castlevania Judgment. Not many releases make me physically ill as much as Castlevania Judgment, because it had the ingredients for a fantastic game. I love fighting games. I love Castlevania. I love, Guilty Gear, the art from Death Note. It had all those nuances that I would absolutely love, but it's just not a good fighting game. It feels so departed from the Castlevania world. It honestly felt like that this would have been a great fighting game by itself, but Konami was like, hey, let's make this Castlevania because that's really popular right now. There's a scene with Maria that still plays in my mind that I'm just like, oh God, it's just so cringe. So cringe.
They're huge. Will you stop? These things only get in the way.
Now, Castlevania Order of Ecclesia for the DS, the last Castlevania, I believe, from Igarashi himself. But this one right here, I'm put it in the C. It's almost a D. But the only reason why I don't absolutely hate Order of Ecclesia is because I hadn't finished it. I can't give a full opinion on it, but it just didn't grab me like Portrait of Ruin did, or even Dawn of Sorrow in that regard. I don't know. By the time Order of Ecclesia came out, I was feeling kind of Castlevania'd out. I mean, that sounds really weird in today's, atmosphere with Konami and Castlevania, but at that point I was getting a little bit of serious fatigue, and I did like the fact that Order of Ecclesia wasn't so much of a Metroidvania. It still had some Metroidvania aspects to it, but it was a lot more linear compared to the other two releases on the DS. But I don't know. I just didn't like Order of Ecclesia as much. Another A tier, and a game that made me buy a whole console. You guys have heard this plenty of times if you're fans of the channel, but Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles made me buy a PSP. And you gotta understand, at this time, I had never played Rondo of Blood, and I had always heard from like Castlevania enthusiasts that Rondo of Blood was just this amazing game. It was the best 2D classic Castlevania. So being able to experience it on the PSP with a new coat of paint, I actually really liked the character models in the remake. But you could also unlock the original Rondo of Blood and unlock Castlevania Symphony Night with subjectively better or worse voice acting. This was a steal. This was such a value, and it's a shame. It's a shame we got Castlevania Requiem that has Symphony Night and Rondo of Blood that's the ports from Dracula X Chronicles, but we still haven't had a re-release of Dracula X Chronicles, like the remake of Rondo, because I would have really enjoyed to have that, like, say, on the Nintendo Switch. It's a great game. Rondo of Blood needs no introduction. It's obviously A tier. It's a great classic Castlevania, and being able to experience that with the Chronicle release on PSP was just amazing. I cannot recommend this game enough for any fans of Castlevania. Castlevania Harmony of Despair was actually my first digital purchase, the first digital game I ever bought, and on pen and paper, it sounded like a very promising game in the sense that this was a multiplayer Castlevania. You got with your friends, you went and you had the whole labyrinth of a stage, you had an objective, but I just didn't really like it. I felt like it was it was definitely D tier. It's not as bad. Let's put Judgment behind it. It's not as bad as Judgment, but I mean, I felt like it was kind of like Legends. It was kind of phoned in, and I didn't have a whole lot of friends to play multiplayer, so there was really no single player campaign for Harmony of Despair, and I didn't like how it kind of zoomed out. I understood that it zoomed out so everyone could see what was happening on the stage, but it just made me look like I was playing Castlevania Ants. That's what it felt like. It felt like a game for ants, and I just did not like Harmony of Despair. Just didn't flow with me. I reviewed this game just a couple of months ago, actually. Castlevania Rebirth. That's going to be getting a B tier. It's a shame that a lot of folks are not going to be able to play Castlevania Adventure Rebirth because it was a WiiWare exclusive on the Nintendo Wii, and that shop closed down a long time ago now. So the only way you can actually experience this game is piracy. Just got to be honest, it's piracy. But a lot better than Castlevania Adventure on the OG Game Boy, like night and day. And, you know, this feels more like a tribute to those classic Castlevanias that I grew up with, much more than just a new Castlevania Adventure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Konami was doing a lot of these revamped IPs for the WiiWare platform, and it's a shame they haven't, you know, bundled this all in some sort of collection for like a physical or something, because they did, you know, Contra, and I really like Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. If you want to know more about my opinions, definitely check out the review I made just recently. Castlevania Lord of the Shadows, I feel like, is a very divisive game for Castlevania fans. There are some Castlevania enthusiasts that really prefer Castlevania just to be 2D. They don't like any of the 3D Castlevanias. I remember playing Lord of the Shadows and being really taken back because when I played God of War back on the PS2, I was like, man, I'd love to play a Castlevania like this. And essentially, that's what Lord of the Shadows is. It's like God of War meets Castlevania with a little bit of Shadow Colossus in there. I really loved the art style. It really had a very thick Western folklore atmosphere to it. And the story was very, very different, and different enough that really intrigued me to see what else would happen in this world of Castlevania. So with that being said, Castlevania Lord of Shadows definitely gets a B. It's a game you can still play now, especially on the Xbox with the backwards compatibility. You can play it on PlayStation Plus as well, but it's streaming and it's kind of laggy. But it's definitely worth the play. I mean, it's a great just standalone action game. It's awesome. I like Lord of the Shadows. I thought it was great. Castlevania Mirrors of Fate on the 3DS is another game that, honestly, kind of a C tier. It's not a bad game. It's not a good game. It's an okay game. I felt like this was really a testament of what Mercury Steam would be cooking up in the later years with a lot of their Metroid titles. Really tapped down on this 2.5D sort of gameplay, and I really feel like they were cutting their teeth with Mirrors of Fate. Really interesting continuation of Lord of the Shadows. I thought the Trevor Belmont Alucard thing was kind of weird, but it also really made a lot of sense, and it's probably one of my favorite designs of Simon Belmont. I'm a big fan of his character design. It's a game that I bought a 3DS to play, honestly. This was much like Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles, where I was like, oh, they're bringing out a new Castlevania. I gotta buy a 3DS now. So, yeah, Castlevania Mirrors of Fate isn't bad. It's not a game that I always go back to, but it's maybe a game I should go back and play again because it wasn't a terrible experience. Now, I do want to add that you can play Castlevania Mirrors of Fate on the PS3. They did an HD remaster of it, but that goes into Lords of Shadows 2, and it's getting a D. It's right there with Castlevania Judgment as like the worst Castlevanias I've ever played. Lords of Shadows took a lot of liberties and a lot of inspirations from various other titles that were popular at the time, but Lords of Shadows 2 feels like a parody of what was cool in video games. I didn't like the stealth. I don't want to play stealth in a Castlevania game. I thought, the idea of Gabriel Belmont turning into a rat and going to air duct sound okay on pen and paper, but playing the game itself, it just felt so broken. I was not a fan of Lord of Shadows 2, and such a sad conclusion to the tier list. But yeah, it was not a good game. But anyway, guys, that is my Castlevania tier list. What is your tier list? What are some of your favorite Castlevania games? I know some of my opinions may be different from you guys, but that's okay. That just leaves room for more engagement in this video. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, but also hit that bell for notifications so you're notified on any sort of new content or live streams that come out on this channel. As always, guys, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. And as always, happy gaming.